You are a senator's wife in Rome. The year is 45 AD. The air is heavy with the scent of olives and burning incense drifting from nearby shrines. Your husband is away at the forum, surrounded by marble columns and the heated debates of politics. Your children are with their tutors, reciting Homer and copying Latin verse, their voices rising faintly in the courtyard. You are at home, preparing for the evening meal, thinking about nothing more extraordinary than which cut of meat to serve, when a sudden knock shakes your door. Imperial guards stand outside, their polished helmets glinting beneath the sun, shields resting against their shoulders. Their faces betray nothing, not hostility, not kindness, only the cold efficiency of men carrying out an order. They do not come for your husband. They do not accuse you of any crime. Instead, they deliver a message with the weight of a decree. The Empress herself has summoned you. You are told this is an honor, an imperial request. To refuse would not only shame your household, but endanger your family's future. Yet deep down, in the pit of your stomach, you feel the ground shift beneath your feet. Because what awaits you at the palace is not service, but humiliation so profound it will destroy your marriage, stain your children's names, and reduce you to a plaything for Rome's most powerful woman. This actually happened. Her name was Valeria Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, and for nearly 7 years she held sway over an empire of 60 million souls. History remembers her as youthful and striking, the empress who bore Claudius an heir and brought a measure of stability to Rome after Caligula's bloody downfall. The statues show her in flowing robes, serene and dignified, a marble vision of imperial virtue. But the marble lies. Behind the smooth stone facade, Messalina built something darker than scandal, something that stretched beyond mere lust or reckless affairs. She orchestrated what can only be described as a vast system of exploitation, a machine of degradation so twisted that even Roman historians, men writing in a society where slavery and concubinage were normal, struggled to put the horrors into words. Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, they recorded fragments of it with disgust, their pens faltering at the scale of her depravity. This was not just the whim of a powerful woman abusing her station. It was systematic, it was calculated, a mechanism that blended politics, pleasure, and punishment into one seamless apparatus of control. A nightmare disguised as entertainment. A shadow empire hiding in plain sight within the heart of Rome itself. Imagine it, the Empress of Rome, not content to rule from the gilded halls of power, creating a secret empire where the humiliation of noble women became both sport and statecraft. This was no private indulgence, it was institutional. There were records, registers, schedulers, even profit margins. Lives measured, catalogued, and stripped of dignity. And the most disturbing truth? It worked. Messalina understood something chilling, that shame can be more powerful than chains, that a ruined name can destroy a family more thoroughly than the sword. Her cruelty was not chaos, it was administration. It was bureaucracy weaponized against the most elite women of Rome, turning them into imperial assets. This is where our story begins. Behind closed doors of the Palatine, beneath frescoes of gods and heroes, in rooms meant for council and celebration, an empire of degradation thrived, and its architect was not an emperor, but the empress, smiling, calculating, untouchable. What I am about to tell you is not rumor. It comes from Roman court records, from the writings of Tacitus, who lived through the reign, from letters preserved in dusty archives, and even from walls unearthed in the ruins of the palace. Together, they reveal not just the life of one woman, but a chilling truth about how power corrupts when left unchecked. Messalina's shadow empire was not simply about affairs, nor was it the reckless hunger of a young woman with too much power and too little restraint. It was something larger, colder, and far more organized. What she created inside the palace was an industry, a hidden system of sexual exploitation that ran with the precision of a business empire, not the chaos of scandal. Roman society, in many ways, was already accustomed to excess. The Romans tolerated spectacles of blood in the Colosseum, feasts that lasted for days, and the public ownership of slaves who had no rights at all. Lust and brutality were not strangers to their world. And yet, even in this culture, historians struggled to write about Messalina's deeds. Tacitus, known for his restrained, cutting style, noted her shamelessness with a disgust so sharp that his sentences read like the grinding of teeth. Juvenal, the satirist, sneered that she slipped away from the palace at night to indulge her cravings like the lowest of prostitutes. Even in a society where sex was currency, Messalina's empire was too grotesque to be dismissed as mere vice. Because this was not indulgence, this was strategy. Behind the marble doors of the palace, Messalina turned humiliation into a weapon of political control. Every summons, every forced encounter, every staged performance chipped away at Rome's most powerful families. Senators who opposed her knew their wives and daughters could be plucked from their homes under the guise of imperial service. Rival families who might have dreamed of rising higher in influence found themselves paralyzed by the threat of shame. Those who complied gained favor. Those who resisted lost everything. Think about the genius of this. A soldier uses a sword to strike his enemy down, but Messalina wielded disgrace, a weapon that bled not the body, but the soul, staining a family's honor for generations. Rome was a society built on reputation, where a name could mean more than wealth. To tarnish that name was to cripple a lineage forever. And so her empire thrived. It was systematic. Record keepers noted names and lineages. Schedules ensured a steady rotation of victims. Profits were calculated, as if the humiliation of noblewomen could be reduced to numbers on a wax tablet. The palace became less a home of emperors and more the headquarters of a machine designed to dismantle Rome's nobility from within. When I first read these accounts, I couldn't help but pause. How could something so organized, so deliberate, be hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade? The answer lies in the power of normalization. The language of empire cloaked everything in grandeur. Families weren't being exploited, they were being honored with imperial service. Women weren't being degraded, they were contributing to Rome's stability. It was propaganda at its most insidious, dressing cruelty in the robes of patriotism. And once that disguise took hold, Rome's elite found themselves trapped. To speak out meant social death. To endure meant survival. And so the machine turned, quietly, relentlessly, until exploitation itself became part of the empire's functioning. This was Messalina's hidden Rome, not the one carved in stone or praised by poets, but a darker city, thriving in the shadows of the Palatine. The Palatine Hill, seat of Roman power, was not merely a palace, it was a symbol. Its halls glittered with marble from Greece, mosaics of gods and victories stretched across the floors, and frescoes adorned the walls with images of Jupiter's thunderbolts and Venus's beauty. To step inside was to walk into the very heart of the empire, the place where emperors lived, generals plotted, and senators trembled. And yet, under Messalina's command, these same sacred chambers became something else entirely, a brothel of the highest order, where Rome's most honored women were stripped of dignity and forced into roles no one could have imagined. This was not a hidden corner or some remote villa. Messalina transformed the palace itself, the imperial residence of Claudius, into a stage of degradation. It was here, beneath gilded ceilings and marble columns, that senators' wives and consuls' daughters were paraded, not as matrons of noble families, but as imperial assets, offered to men who understood that to decline the invitation of the empress was to invite ruin. And it was not random. Nothing about this network was spontaneous. Messalina orchestrated it with chilling precision. Her agents carried what they called recruitment lists, but these lists were nothing but casual. They were dossiers, carefully assembled files on Rome's most powerful women. Each entry detailed not only names, but political connections, family loyalties, debts owed, and even personal vulnerabilities. Picture it. You live as a Roman matron, cloaked in dignity, your family name a shield against dishonor. Then, one morning, men from the palace arrive. They do not ask, they inform. Your name has appeared on the list. It is presented as an honor, as proof of your family's loyalty to the empire. To refuse would not only stain your reputation, but it would imperil your husband's career, your children's future, your family's very survival. The illusion of choice was the sharpest cruelty of all. Once selected, the transformation began. Whatever made you, your name, your lineage, your private life, was stripped away. You were no longer Julia or Antonia or Livala. In the records of the palace, you became nothing but an entry in a ledger, a commodity categorized by attributes, age, and perceived appeal. Roman historians wrote that women were rated like products in a luxury catalog. Files noted physical descriptions, personality traits, even temperament. Assessments of whether a woman might resist or whether she would submit quickly under pressure. It was not unlike the way merchants classified exotic goods arriving at Rome's ports, except these were not goods. These were Rome's mothers, wives, and daughters. Messalina understood the psychology of power. By targeting Rome's most elite women, she ensured her control reached far beyond the palace walls. A senator whose wife had been summoned could never oppose her without risking exposure. A consul whose daughter had been entered into the catalogue lived in permanent fear of disgrace. With every recruitment, Messalina tightened her grip on the nobility like a spider weaving strands into a web, each thread binding a family more tightly to her will. And so, the palace, the place where laws were written, where emperors ruled, where Rome's destiny was decided, was quietly reshaped into something unrecognizable. A brothel not for common men, but for Rome's most privileged, and at its center, an empress whose smile concealed chains stronger than iron. What strikes you most about Messalina's empire is not only the cruelty, it is the organization. This was no chaotic debauchery hidden in the shadows. It was a system, polished and perfected until it resembled the smooth machinery of Roman administration itself. The palace files reveal a chilling truth. Noblewomen were processed like inventory. There were schedulers who managed appointments, attendants who matched clients with assets, and scribes who kept ledgers tracking payments and favors. Victims were cataloged with the same detached precision Rome used for census rolls, land registries, or military supplies. Flesh and blood reduced to numbers, check marks, and marginal notes. Medical examinations ensured that women were deemed fit for service, as if they were gladiators preparing for the arena. Client preferences were recorded with unsettling detail: hair color, body type, even personality traits. Some wanted timid women who would break easily. Others demanded spirited ones who could be humiliated into submission. And all of it was written down, preserved in wax tablets and scrolls. Once inside the palace system, women lost their very identities. They were stripped not only of clothing, but of the dignity their names carried. No longer were they Julia, daughter of a senator, or Antonia, the wife of a consul. They became what the palace chillingly referred to as imperial assets, objects, not people, units in a system. And the men who came to use them were not shadowy figures from the gutters of Rome. They were senators looking to secure favor in the Senate, merchants willing to pay handsomely for access to power, foreign ambassadors seeking proof of Rome's hospitality. For these men, the very degradation of the women was the attraction. It wasn't simply intimacy they sought. It was the prestige of sleeping with the wife of a senator or the daughter of a consul, while the empress herself approved. To be summoned was to be broken twice over. First in body, when stripped of agency and forced into service. But perhaps more devastating was the second breaking, the slow destruction of a woman's identity, her transformation from matron to merchandise. Imagine walking into a palace that should symbolize the greatness of Rome, only to find it functioning like a grotesque auction house. The same meticulous care that governed grain shipments from Egypt or tax collection in Gaul was now being applied to human dignity. Bureaucracy, Rome's proudest invention, twisted into a weapon of dehumanization.
Messalina's cruelty went beyond secrecy. She did not simply reduce Rome's noblewomen to commodities behind closed doors. She turned their degradation into a spectacle. It was not enough to exploit. She had to perform, to transform the humiliation of others into entertainment for the elite of Rome. This was the theater of shame. Inside specially prepared chambers of the palace, noblewomen were made to compete with professional prostitutes in grotesque contests of endurance. The rules were simple. Who could outlast the other? Who could endure the most? Who could serve the most men in a single span of time? It was cruelty disguised as competition, staged before an audience who laughed, wagered, and applauded as though watching gladiators fight in the Colosseum. The most infamous of these contests is recorded by Pliny the Elder. Messalina, Empress of Rome, descended into the arena herself to face off against Scylla, one of the city's most renowned prostitutes. The challenge? To see who could sleep with more men in 24 hours. The spectators, wealthy Romans, courtiers, and sycophants, watched as if it were sport, and according to Pliny, Messalina emerged the victor with 25 encounters before the day was done. 25 men in one day performed as a contest of imperial stamina. It is almost impossible to imagine. The Empress, wife of the Emperor, mother of his heir, competing not in diplomacy or in the influence of statecraft, but in a sexual endurance match staged for the delight of her circle. The palace, Rome's sacred center of power, reduced to an amphitheater of debasement. And what did this mean for the women dragged into these contests? They were not only forced to serve, they were forced to do so in front of strangers, stripped not just of dignity, but of privacy itself. Their humiliation was no longer a hidden wound. It was a public mark, a spectacle replayed in whispers across Rome's streets, a story that followed them home and tainted their families forever. The Romans, accustomed to brutality, still found this difficult to reconcile. Gladiators shed blood for honor. Generals waged war for glory. But these women, their suffering carried no honor, no nobility, only mockery. And that was the point. To Messalina, degradation itself was the currency. She turned shame into spectacle, and spectacle into power. Imagine sitting in that hall, hearing the laughter of men as noble matrons, women who once walked proudly through Rome's forums in their stola and veils, were paraded like entertainers. Imagine knowing that your turn might come next. This was Messalina's Rome, a world where the most powerful woman in the empire wielded humiliation not only as a weapon, but as a performance.
Messalina's network was not confined to the walls of the Palatine. What began as a personal web of indulgence and domination soon grew into something far more dangerous, a tool of diplomacy, blackmail, and imperial expansion. Foreign rulers who visited Rome often expected lavish hospitality, banquets overflowing with wine, processions of dancers, the grandeur of Rome displayed in all its glory. Messalina gave them something else. She offered not common courtesans, but Rome's own noblewomen. Imagine the shock of a provincial king or a foreign ambassador being gifted the daughter of a senator as part of his welcome. To decline would be an insult. To accept was to step willingly into Messalina's snare. But this was not generosity, it was calculation. Every encounter was recorded. Messalina's scribes documented names, details, and circumstances, preserving them in archives that could be opened whenever leverage was needed. Today, we might call it blackmail. To the Romans, it was imperial favor with strings attached.
A foreign ruler who accepted Rome's hospitality could never quite refuse its demands later, for his shame was written down in the palace records. And it was not only foreigners. Rome's own politicians, merchants, and generals were caught in the same trap. Sleep with a senator's wife under Messalina's watchful eye, and you belonged to her. She could summon the record of that night years later if you dared oppose her. What was once whispered in the shadows could become the end of a career, a weapon wielded with the authority of the Empress herself. Perhaps most terrifying was how this system spread. Roman governors in the provinces, seeing how effectively Messalina's network controlled both allies and rivals, began copying it. In Gaul, in Hispania, in the eastern provinces, whispers of similar imperial hospitality emerged. What began as the Empress's personal empire of exploitation metastasized into a culture of abuse woven into the very fabric of Roman governance. The infrastructure followed. Archaeological evidence suggests that sections of government buildings in Rome and beyond were quietly modified. Rooms partitioned, chambers outfitted, not for councils or courts, but for the same purpose Messalina had pioneered in the palace. The humiliation of women was no longer only a private vice of the imperial household. It had become a political technology, replicated and institutionalized across the Mediterranean world. Think of the implications. An empire that conquered with its legions abroad now controlled its own elite at home through shame. Rome was not only a military machine, it was becoming a psychological one, and Messalina, with her ledgers and records, was its chief architect.
For the women forced into Messalina's system, the damage went far beyond the walls of the palace. It was not only their bodies that were taken from them, it was their very selves, their identity as Roman matrons, as mothers, as wives. One day, you are seated in the atrium of your home, receiving visitors with dignity, wrapped in the stola that marks your status as a married woman. The next, you are summoned to the palace and reduced to an asset, paraded before men who treat your name not as heritage, but as entertainment. It was a collapse of identity so sudden, so complete, that many never recovered. The psychological toll was devastating. Some women, once pillars of their households, returned from the palace broken and hollow. Their marriages, in many cases, could not survive. Roman law was merciless. A husband's honor was irreparably damaged if his wife was known to have prostituted herself, even if forced by the empress. To continue living with her was seen as dishonorable. Many husbands withdrew, cast their wives aside, or retreated into cold silence, unable to reconcile dignity with disgrace. And what of the women themselves? Some endured in silence, retreating from public life forever. Others could not bear the shame. Ancient sources speak of suicides, women who chose death over the slow humiliation of living marked by what had been done to them. For those who lived, shame was hereditary. Their children bore scars as well. In Rome, family reputation was everything. A child whose mother had served in Messalina's palace carried a stain that no wealth, no military service, no achievements could fully erase. Young men found doors to political advancement closed. Young women found marriage prospects vanish, as no noble house wished to ally itself with a family whose name had been soiled. This was the true brilliance and cruelty of Messalina's design.
By attacking women, she struck entire bloodlines. A single recruitment could unravel a family for generations. In a society where memory and reputation mattered more than gold, she weaponized disgrace as a curse that lingered long after the act itself. Think about what this meant. Rome, a civilization that prided itself on its lineage, its gens, its heritage stretching back to the founding myths of Aeneas and Romulus, now watched its noble families disintegrate, not on the battlefield, but in the bedrooms of the Imperial Palace. Messalina's shadow empire did not simply destroy individuals, it fractured Rome's very social fabric, breaking the bonds of trust, loyalty, and family that held the elite together. It was a slow poison, seeping into the heart of the empire.
In Messalina's Rome, there was no safe refusal. To decline her summons was not an act of dignity, it was a death sentence. One of the clearest examples comes from her own family. Appius Solanus, her stepfather, was a man of stature and honor, serving as governor of Spain. He had married Messalina's mother, tying him into the imperial household. By all accounts, he carried out his duties faithfully. But when Messalina cast her eyes upon him, not as a daughter to a stepfather, but as a predator seeking new prey, he resisted. He rejected her advances, horrified at her audacity. That defiance sealed his fate. Messalina was clever enough not to stain her own hands directly. Instead, she used the emperor himself as her instrument of murder. Claudius, by nature, was a man deeply superstitious, haunted by omens and dreams. Messalina knew this weakness and exploited it. One evening, she went to him with feigned alarm. "Husband, I dreamed last night of Solanus murdering you." Days later, Narcissus, Claudius's powerful secretary and one of Messalina's close allies, entered with the same fabricated story. He too had dreamed of Solanus striking down the emperor. Two voices, two dreams. What Claudius saw not as manipulation, but as divine warning. And so, when Solanus arrived for his regular audience with the emperor, Claudius viewed his very presence as the fulfillment of the omen. Without trial, without defense, Solanus was executed on imperial command. A loyal governor, a man bound to Messalina by family, was struck down. His only crime was saying no. This episode reveals the depth of her cunning. Messalina did not wield a dagger. She wielded psychology. She weaponized the emperor's fears, his belief in the supernatural, to make him an accomplice to her crimes. It was murder by proxy, sanctioned by the emperor himself, all while Messalina smiled in the shadows. But Solanus was not the only one. Time and again, those who resisted were eliminated, not just for revenge, but for profit. In Rome, anyone condemned for treason had their property seized by the state, and much of it found its way into Messalina's hands. For her, death was not just justice twisted, but business. Resistance, therefore, was not only futile, it was suicidal. The message rippled across Rome's elite: bend to the will of the empress, or see your name blotted out, your estates confiscated, your blood spilled. The threat was so effective that many families did not even dare whisper dissent. In this climate, terror was silent but omnipresent. A senator walking through the forum, a consul addressing the Senate, a general returning from the frontier, all carried the same unspoken fear, that the empress might one day knock at their door, and refusal would mean ruin. This is how Messalina tightened her grip, not through open war, but through the slow erosion of courage, until silence became Rome's only defense.
Messalina's empire was not only about power and lust, it was about profit. Every act of degradation, every execution, every confiscated estate added to her wealth and influence. The machinery of exploitation doubled as a marketplace where human lives and noble estates were turned into currency. Consider the case of Valerius Asiaticus, a wealthy senator who owned the famous gardens of Lucullus. These gardens were more than mere land. They were a marvel of Rome, filled with fountains, shaded colonnades, and terraces where generals once celebrated their triumphs. Messalina coveted them, and in Rome, when the empress coveted something, it rarely remained out of reach for long. She accused Asiaticus of treason, always the easiest charge in an empire where suspicion alone could kill. The trial was a mockery of justice, staged not in a Senate chamber, but in the emperor's bedroom, with Messalina herself watching from the side like a vulture awaiting its feast. Asiaticus nearly escaped conviction. The evidence was thin, his reputation sound, but at the last moment the proceedings were sabotaged. He was condemned, and the gardens, his life's pride, fell neatly into Messalina's hands. This was the pattern. When she orchestrated the fall of an enemy, it was never only for revenge or security. It was also for gain. A noble's execution meant their estates were seized, their wealth redistributed, and time after time Messalina ensured that much of it flowed to her coffers. Meanwhile, the prostitution network itself generated steady revenue. Wealthy merchants and foreign dignitaries paid heavily for the privilege of imperial hospitality. These profits, combined with confiscated estates, turned Messalina's shadow empire into a criminal enterprise disguised as government. It is chilling to realize how smoothly her corruption blended with Rome's official systems. Property confiscation was already a standard punishment for treason. Patronage was already a path to advancement. Messalina simply twisted these mechanisms to her advantage, cloaking her greed in the language of justice and loyalty. What emerges is not the image of an empress consumed by reckless desire, but of a woman who understood the economics of power. Exploitation was profitable. Blackmail was lucrative. Death itself became a business strategy.
The question lingers like a shadow over every account of Messalina's reign. How could Emperor Claudius not have known? How does a man live in the very palace where his wife runs a criminal empire and yet remain blind to it? Part of the answer lies in Claudius himself. He was not born to rule. For much of his life he had been mocked by his family, dismissed as weak, bookish, even feeble-minded. The Senate considered him a scholar at best, a fool at worst. When Caligula was assassinated and Claudius was dragged from hiding behind a curtain and proclaimed emperor,
Many believed Rome now had a puppet on the throne, and perhaps, in some ways, they were right. Claudius was a man of habits, easily distracted by ritual and study, prone to superstition. He surrounded himself with secretaries and freedmen who managed the machinery of state, leaving him vulnerable to manipulation. Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, men of the palace, often guided his hand. And among them, Messalina thrived, exploiting her husband's trust, presenting her empire of degradation not as chaos, but as loyalty to Rome. This was her genius. She normalized the grotesque. Women were not being forced into prostitution. They were being honored with imperial service. Families were not being blackmailed. They were proving their devotion to the empire. By wrapping her crimes in the language of duty, Messalina concealed them beneath a cloak of legitimacy. And Rome's families, desperate to protect their futures, often played along. To refuse meant ruin. To comply brought rewards, contracts, political advancement, military commissions. In a world where survival depended on imperial favor, many found it easier to feign enthusiasm than risk defiance. Imagine the scene. A senator whose wife has been summoned by Messalina enters the forum the next morning. He smiles. He pretends pride in the honor disposed upon his household. Inside, shame burns him alive, but silence is safer than truth. Multiply this silence across dozens of families, and the illusion becomes reality. An empire of degradation hidden in plain sight because no one dared speak of it. This is why Claudius remained blind. He was not only deceived by his wife's cunning, but shielded by the silence of Rome's elite, who found themselves bound by fear, complicity, and the iron weight of shame. And so the emperor, draped in purple, issuing decrees, inspecting aqueducts, presiding over the Senate, remained oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, to the empire of humiliation flourishing in the very rooms of his own palace.
Messalina's greatest triumph was not only that she controlled people's actions, it was that she controlled their beliefs. Through careful manipulation, she reshaped how Rome's nobility thought about honor, service, and loyalty, bending cultural values until exploitation itself seemed like duty. The language she used was deceptively simple. Women summoned to the palace were not forced, they were chosen. Their participation was not prostitution, it was imperial service. Families were not being coerced, they were being given the opportunity to demonstrate loyalty to Rome. By clothing horror in the language of honor, Messalina turned degradation into something that could be publicly praised, even envied. Over time, the illusion hardened into reality. Families who cooperated received gifts, contracts, promotions, military commands. Their loyalty was so visibly that others followed suit, competing with each other to appear eager. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. To resist was to invite ruin. And so, Rome's aristocracy learned to mask fear with enthusiasm, to call chains an honor, and humiliation a privilege. This conditioning seeped into the next generation.
Boys raised in households where their mothers had been summoned grew up believing this was simply part of Rome's order. They learned early that the state and the empress had the power to dictate what their wives or sisters might one day endure. Girls, meanwhile, grew up under the silent dread that their bodies might one day be claimed by the empire. In whispers, in silences, in unspoken warnings passed between mothers and daughters, the fear became hereditary. And it spread beyond Rome. Provincial governors, watching how effectively Messalina's system consolidated power in the capital, began to imitate it. Across Gaul, Hispania, Asia Minor, the same twisted formula appeared. Select local elites, dress humiliation as loyalty, and bind rival families with chains of shame. Soon, what began as Messalina's personal indulgence evolved into a kind of imperial policy. The infrastructure of exploitation, rooms set aside in government buildings, coded records hidden among official documents, trained attendants who knew how to manage assets, all became part of Rome's machinery. Imagine arriving in Rome as a foreign diplomat. You are dazzled by triumphal arches, awed by the legions, humbled by the Senate, and then, as part of your hospitality, you are discreetly introduced to a senator's wife or a consul's daughter, as though it were as natural a gesture of Rome's greatness as presenting bread and wine. What began as horror became normalized, until the empire itself wore the mask of complicity. This was the quietest, most insidious victory Messalina achieved. Not the creation of a brothel in the palace, but the reprogramming of a civilization to accept humiliation as order, cruelty as loyalty, and silence as survival.
For all her cunning, Messalina could not silence the one thing Rome was most obsessive about: its records. The empire lived on paper, on wax tablets, on scrolls carefully copied and preserved. Taxes, grain shipments, military campaigns, everything was written down. And so, too, the shadow empire of humiliation left behind its traces. Palace administrators documented everything. Names of women conscripted into imperial service, the schedules of their use, the preferences of their clients. There were even financial reports tallying the profits earned, as though the degradation of Rome's matrons could be measured in denarii. Some records read like ledgers of a merchant house, but the goods were senators' wives and consuls' daughters. Medical examinations were noted, with cold descriptions of bodies treated not as human, but as inventory. Victim profiles included personality assessments, ranking women by how compliant or resistant they might be. These were not rumors whispered in taverns. They were the official documents of the imperial household. Fragments of these files survived the centuries. In the Vatican's secret archives lie scraps of financial accounts, lists of expenditures tied to the empress's private chambers. In the Capitoline museums are preserved letters between administrators that outline how women were chosen and rotated through service. Archaeological excavations of the Palatine itself have revealed modifications to rooms, chambers refitted not for governance, but for exploitation.
thick walls where whispers could not escape, drains and alcoves that suggest use far removed from imperial banquets. Even more chilling are the coded words found in imperial correspondence. Innocuous phrases like attending the banquet or presenting loyalty turn out, under analysis, to be euphemisms for forced participation. Modern historians, piecing together these fragments with forensic precision, have begun to reconstruct just how systematic Messalina's machine was. And yet, what survives may only be a fraction. Much was deliberately destroyed after Messalina's downfall, burned, hidden, erased by those who wished Rome's shame to vanish with her. But enough remains to show the outline of the system, enough to prove this was no slander invented by enemies, no exaggerated tale of scandal. It is in the dry numbers of ledgers, the bureaucratic neatness of schedules, the architectural scars left in the palace walls, that we see the true horror, because those records reveal something terrifying. Messalina's empire of humiliation was not chaos. It was order. Not a crime of passion, but a policy written down, counted, preserved.
When historians attempt to measure the reach of Messalina's network, the numbers are staggering. Surviving accounts suggest that hundreds of Roman families were directly touched by her empire of shame, and thousands more lived in constant dread of being chosen. To live in Rome during her reign was to live with the knowledge that the knock at your door might come at any moment, and that nothing, not rank nor virtue, could protect you. But the true scale is almost certainly greater than the records show. For every name preserved on a wax tablet or etched into a letter, there were likely many more deliberately erased. After Messalina's downfall, administrators loyal to Claudius worked feverishly to destroy the most incriminating evidence. They wanted Rome to forget, to bury the scandal so deep that it would not corrode the empire's reputation for centuries to come. What remains to us today is likely only the shadow of something much larger. The impact was generational. Imagine growing up in a noble household after your mother had been summoned to the palace. Perhaps she returned broken and silent, never again appearing in public. Perhaps she never returned at all. Either way, the mark of disgrace clung to you like smoke. It followed young men into the Senate, whispered by rivals as a stain on their family honor. It followed young women into betrothals, their marriage prospects dashed by the memory of their mother's imperial service. This was the slowest kind of poison, not a dagger thrust in the night, but shame that seeped down through the bloodline, corroding a family's standing for generations. In Rome, where lineage and reputation were as valuable as gold, such shame could cripple a dynasty more effectively than war. And it did not end at Rome's gates. Reports of similar practices spread across the provinces, where governors imitated the empress's system as a way to control local elites. A senator in Gaul, a magistrate in Hispania, a wealthy merchant in Asia Minor, all lived with the same fear that Rome's empress had taught them.
Fear not of chains, but of humiliation. In this sense, Messalina's empire was not confined to the palace. It was an infection, spreading outward from the capital, replicating itself wherever Rome's authority extended. The empire, already vast in territory, became just as vast in its reach of fear. When we try to understand the true scope of Messalina's system, it is not enough to count families or provinces. We must reckon with the invisible scars, entire generations marked by silence, entire bloodlines broken, the unrecorded thousands who carried shame to their braves. What remains in history is but the tip of an iceberg. Beneath it lies a darkness too vast to measure.
For nearly 7 years, Messalina's empire of humiliation thrived in the shadows, protected by silence, cloaked in the language of loyalty, and tolerated by those too afraid to resist. But even the most careful manipulator can be undone, not by her enemies, but by her own ambition. In the year 48 AD, Claudius was away from Rome, inspecting harbors at Ostia. With the emperor absent, Messalina made the most reckless move of her life. She staged a wedding. Not a secret tryst in the shadows, not another discreet indulgence, but a public ceremony, legal in every form, binding in every ritual. And the groom was not her husband, it was her lover, Gaius Silius, a handsome, ambitious senator whose rising star threatened to eclipse even Claudius's advisors. The audacity is staggering. Bigamy was not only scandalous, it was treason. For an empress to marry another man while her husband still lived was to declare the emperor himself irrelevant, a pawn to be replaced. Some historians argue that this was not merely lust, but an attempted coup. By marrying Silius, Messalina may have been plotting to place him on the throne beside her, making her empress twice over, once by marriage to Claudius, and again through alliance with his rival. The wedding was no quiet affair. It was a festival, a spectacle that flaunted everything she had built. Guests feasted as noblewomen, her past victims, were forced to serve as entertainment, a grotesque finale to the years of degradation she had orchestrated. Musicians played, torches blazed, and Messalina, still wife of the emperor, stood before Rome's gods and pledged herself to another man. But in that moment of triumph, she committed her fatal error. She made her private empire public. For years, her system had thrived precisely because it was shrouded in silence, cloaked in euphemism, hidden behind the veils of propriety. Now she tore away that veil. Rumors became undeniable. Whispers became shouts. When news of the marriage reached Claudius, even his loyal freedmen, men who had shielded him from so many truths, could not protect her. Narcissus, once her ally, turned against her, recognizing that this act could topple the emperor himself if left unchecked. For the first time, Claudius could not ignore what his wife had done.
Messalina's empire had not been destroyed by enemies in the Senate, nor by noble families who despised her, nor even by the weight of her own cruelty. It collapsed because she reached too far, exposing herself in a display of arrogance so brazen that even Rome's emperor, blind for so long, was forced to see.
When word of the wedding reached Claudius, it struck like lightning. For years he had lived in the shadows of deception, cocooned by advisors and blinded by the illusions his wife spun around him. But now the truth was undeniable. His empress, still his lawful wife, had publicly married another man. Bigamy, treason, betrayal, all rolled into one single spectacular outrage. Claudius was not a man of quick temper. Historians describe him as hesitant, slow to anger, often wavering in judgment. But even he could not remain still in the face of such humiliation. The emperor's household, long divided between Messalina's supporters and her enemies, suddenly unified. Narcissus, her most trusted ally, abandoned her, seizing the chance to preserve Claudius's dignity and his own survival. Advisors moved swiftly. They knew hesitation could invite disaster. Messalina had powerful allies still loyal to her, and Silius, her new husband, commanded influence among Rome's nobility. If given time, she might rally support and attempt a true coup. So they urged Claudius to act immediately, decisively, before her charm or her cunning could ensnare him again. Meanwhile, in the gardens of Lucullus, the very estate she had once stolen through blood, Messalina realized her empire was collapsing. Guards surrounded the grounds. Her allies deserted her. The same fear she had once inspired in others now crept into her own heart. Desperate, she tried to save herself the only way she knew, through manipulation. She sent messengers pleading for mercy, begging for an audience with Claudius. She had always relied on her beauty, her tears, her ability to sway with words what others could not achieve with swords. And for a brief moment, she may have believed she could do it again. After all, had Claudius not turned a blind eye for years? Had he not believed her every excuse, her every pretense? But this time was different. The emperor's patience had snapped. The humiliation was too public, the betrayal too brazen. No dream or omen could excuse what she had done. When Claudius's guards entered the gardens, Messalina's world shrank to a final choice: face her husband's wrath or attempt to cling to the last remnants of power through desperate pleas. She fell to her knees, trying to negotiate, her voice breaking under the weight of panic. The empress who once commanded Rome's greatest families with a smile was reduced to a trembling woman begging for her life. And still, Claudius did not come. He remained distant, leaving the decision to his freedmen. Narcissus, once her accomplice, now sealed her fate. He ordered the execution in Claudius's name. Messalina, who turned the palace into a brothel, who had enslaved Rome's noble families, who had orchestrated murders and profited from death, now faced the end surrounded not by cheering courtiers, but by silence, betrayal, and the cold steel of imperial justice. The end came not in a blaze of defiance, but in a collapse of dignity. When the soldiers arrived in the gardens of Lucullus, the very estate she had once stolen through deceit and blood, Messalina's courage deserted her. She who had commanded senators' wives, broken noble families, and humiliated Rome's elite, now trembled and wept like a prisoner awaiting judgment. Historians describe her final moments as a scene almost pitiful. She begged, pleaded, grasped at any possibility of pardon. She tried bargaining, promising loyalty, swearing she could still be of use to Claudius. But her words, once weapons sharp enough to bend Rome's most powerful men to her will, fell empty. The spell was broken. When the executioner stood before her, sword in hand, Messalina could not summon the strength to take her own life, as Roman nobility was expected to do. For centuries, Romans had prided themselves on meeting death with stoic resolve. Generals who failed in battle fell on their own swords. Disgraced senators opened their veins in baths. Even women of noble houses sometimes chose suicide to preserve a fragment of honor. But Messalina, who had demanded such obedience from others, could not meet death on her own terms. The task fell to the guards. Some sources claim she tried to resist until the last, sobbing and clawing for her life. Others say she collapsed into silence, paralyzed by terror. Either way, the final blow was delivered not by her own hand, but by another's. There is a haunting symmetry in where it happened. The gardens of Lucullus had once belonged to Valerius Asiaticus, the senator she had falsely accused of treason to seize his estate. He had died so she might possess those gardens. Now she too died there, stripped of power, reduced to nothing more than another casualty of her own schemes. When word of her death reached Claudius, he is said to have shown little reaction. Some historians suggest he was relieved, others that he was too weary to care. Perhaps he had loved her once, perhaps he had been blind, but at the end he seemed eager to erase her memory altogether. Orders were given to destroy her statues, to strike her name from inscriptions. Rome, as it often did with disgraced figures, tried to wipe her from existence. And yet, erasure could not undo the terror she had spread. Whispers of her reign lingered, carried in the memories of those who had suffered, in the shame passed from parent to child. Messalina died violently, without honor. But the echoes of her cruelty would not die with her. It would be easy to dismiss Messalina's story as the tale of one wicked woman consumed by lust and greed. That is how many ancient writers painted her, an empress gone mad with desire, an embodiment of feminine corruption. But that explanation is too simple, almost comforting. Because what truly emerges from the fragments of her reign is not just personal vice, but a system, a machinery of exploitation built from the tools of empire itself. Messalina did not invent cruelty. What made her terrifying was how she organized it. She built her empire the way Rome built aqueducts and roads, with structure, with bureaucracy, with cold efficiency. She twisted the same mechanisms that governed armies and provinces, records, ledgers, laws, and turned them upon the most intimate parts of Roman society. The techniques she used echo throughout history. The manipulation of language, for example, calling prostitution imperial service, calling coercion honor. It is a pattern we recognize in other times and places, where governments disguise cruelty beneath noble words, where institutions transform oppression into duty. There was also the weaponization of shame. Roman society was built on honor and reputation, and Messalina understood that to stain a name was more destructive than to spill blood. Even today, we see how shame, scandal, and humiliation can ruin lives and silence opposition more effectively than force. It is a timeless form of psychological warfare. And then there is normalization. What began as horror became routine. Families, desperate to survive, played along. Children grew up believing this was simply how Rome worked. Entire provinces imitated the system. Slowly, step by step, the monstrous became ordinary. This, too, is a pattern history repeats. Whenever cruelty becomes systematic, it gains the disguise of normalcy. People stop questioning, they adjust. The most chilling lesson from Messalina's reign is not her excesses, but how quickly an entire civilization can adapt to dehumanization when it is packaged correctly. A society that prided itself on law, order, and virtue tolerated systematic exploitation because it was presented as loyalty to the empire. Rome did not collapse when she built her shadow brothel. Rome incorporated it. That is why her story is not only about the 1st century. It is about the human tendency to allow power, when unchecked, to twist values until cruelty looks like tradition. Messalina may be gone, but the mechanisms she exploited, bureaucracy, propaganda, and shame, remain tools that can be used in any age.
Amid the scandal, the corruption, and the spectacle of Messalina's downfall, it is easy to forget the most important part of this story: the women themselves. Thousands of them, wives, daughters, sisters of Rome's nobility, whose names were erased, whose dignity was stripped, whose lives were shattered. History rarely records their voices. The annals of Tacitus and Suetonius mention Messalina's schemes, her lovers, her humiliations, but not the personal stories of the women who endured them. They remain faceless, reduced to statistics in ledgers and fragments in court records, and yet they were real. They lived. They suffered, they carried scars that lingered across generations. Some chose death over dishonor. Others lived on in silence, withdrawing from public life, shadows of the women they once were. Many were never able to marry, or saw their children burdened by hereditary shame. Entire family lines were bent or broken because of what Messalina built. Their trauma, though unrecorded, shaped Rome in ways the marble monuments will never reveal. To remember Messalina's story, then, is not only to recount the excess of one empress. It is to recognize the silent chorus of victims whose pain became invisible beneath her spectacle. Their suffering was not entertainment.
It was the slow destruction of human dignity. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting lesson. Power can twist cruelty into ceremony, humiliation into policy, and exploitation into something called honor. And when it does, entire societies can participate willingly or unwillingly in atrocities they later claim not to see. 2,000 years later, the ruins of the Palatine still stand. Tourists wander its arches admiring mosaics and frescoes, often unaware that some chambers were once stages for Rome's darkest secrets. The stones remember what history tried to forget. So, as we close this story, we must remember not only Messalina, the empress who built an empire of shame, but the countless women whose names have vanished into silence. They were more than entries in a ledger. They were people, deserving of dignity, who deserved to be remembered. And perhaps the most unsettling question remains: if humiliation could become policy in the heart of Rome, could something like this happen again, in another form, in another age? That answer, unsettling as it may be, depends on how carefully we watch the powers of our own time.